Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join us for this webinar this evening, which has been hosted by AHDB Beef and Lamb. My name is Chloe McKee and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb within AHDB. I'm delighted to bring you tonight's webinar on ewe nutrition. Our presenter this evening is independent sheep consultant Lesley Stubbings. The plan of action for this evening is that Lesley will take you through a 30-minute presentation, and then there will be some time for questions and comments at the end. You'll all be muted throughout the webinar, but if anyone would like to ask a question or at any time throughout the presentation, if you think of a question, then please type it into the box on the right-hand side of your screen. When Lesley has finished presenting, I can then ask her those questions. So we've got over 280 people registered tonight. Hopefully we won't encounter any technical difficulties, but please bear with us if there are any. So without further delay, I will hand over to Lesley.
Thank you, Chloe, and good evening, everybody. It's really good to see so many people actually logged on a cold January night. Okay, so without further ado, we've got about half an hour, and really I've pulled out what I think are some pertinent, timely reminders. This year is going to be a little bit different, so we'll try and cover the ground, and hopefully that will elicit some more questions, hopefully something in it for everybody. So, in terms of content for this evening then, I thought maybe we just have a little think about carryover from 2017-18. There are a few things to consider there. We're not quite out of the woods yet. Little bit of a refresher on the principles and objectives. What is it we're actually trying to do with our ewe nutrition at this stage? How much forage do you need? And clearly this is something which we're being asked a lot this year in terms of some people have got limited supplies, others plenty. We'll come back and have a look at that. Choosing a compound, a reminder as to what you can do, what information we've got, so you can actually choose a good quality supplement. And some tips on avoiding some common pitfalls. And all of this is rounded up in Feeding the Ewe, which is the AHDB manual that Kate Phillips and Jill Povey and I wrote some time ago. The internet's chugging away a little bit now. That should come up now. So you can download that off the AHDB website afterwards, and that really does give you a lot more background and covers all of the points again as well. So just thinking about where we are with this year, because we've had over 12 months now where we've had some pretty extreme conditions. The beast from the east, I noticed yesterday somebody was threatening us with again coming up in another 2 or 3 weeks. Let's hope not. But really just to remind you that, you know, we do at the moment, we're concentrating on more of the scanning to lambing, and that's probably what you're looking for some advice from tonight about. But just to remind you that, you know, we are part of a complete production cycle, and we can't just concentrate on this period scanning to lambing. If the ewe has been through a really hard time, we had some really lean ewes at weaning last year, and she found it difficult to put condition back on. We do have to be mindful of that, and I think it does mean that we have to plan ahead and be even more careful to take into consideration body condition when we're running into this late pregnancy period now. So, you know, we're all really used to looking at target body condition scores and where we need to be at a certain point in time. And indeed, these are the sorts of targets that we would want. Ideally now we would want ewes to be in condition score 3, 3.5. But my experience with clients this year already is that, particularly on this side of the country, on the east, where we had a continuous drought for months, we still have quite a lot of lean ewes. On the western side, when I go over to Wales, it can be quite different, and some of the ewes there are actually getting almost too good. So just to emphasise at this stage to you, whatever your sheep are, get in there, get them body condition scored, and at least know where the ones are that are falling outside of that target range. So when we talk about prioritising, you can actually get on and do that. So body condition scoring then, absolutely, it's always important, but this year particularly because of the variation, and many of you have already heard how variable scanning results are this year. I've had them from well over 200%, 250 to 160%, and that does go back to this conditions that we had 6 months or more ago. Okay, so looking at specifically a little bit more in terms of late pregnancy nutrition. The thing that we're trying to do, that we're always trying to do, and the ethos that we try to put across in feeding the ewe, is that we want to optimise the contribution from forage. And there are two reasons for that. Let's remind ourselves. The first one is obvious on the screen at the moment, and that is that forage energy is a heck of a lot cheaper than any other form of energy that we could put in front of our ewes. So we're now, you might be in a position where you're still looking at grazing deferred grass, and absolutely, if you can do that, then you need to monitor that and measure how much is available and how much your ewes actually need. If you can compare that running up through grass silage and up to compound nuts, you could be talking a factor of 5 difference in terms of cost per unit of energy. So it makes absolute sense. And if we get into the realms tonight, as I think we might do, where a lot of us are looking at some alternatives to be able to perhaps try and eke out limited forage supplies, then I've just put a couple of examples in there for you tonight. Wet citrus pulp, last time I priced it up, was going to cost us, if we could get a pause on it, about 1.2 pence per unit of energy, and brewer's grains about 1.7. And of course, what brewer's grains also give us protein. So getting hold of them isn't easy, but there are things that we can do to look at to eke out forage supplies if we need to. So cost is important, but also it's really important from the point of view of the ewe herself. And for quite a long while, we forgot that this was so important, that the rumen function is critical. If we want the ewe to perform well and to be healthy and all things to be equal, then we need to look after that rumen. And to do that, the rumen needs a constant balanced nutrient supply, needs a supply of fermentable energy for the bugs. So that's from forage and digestible fibre, particularly a little bit of sugar, a little bit of starch. And if necessary, we top that up with concentrates. And it also needs a supply of degradable protein. And I will come back to that because I think this year we are going to see a few more issues on these farms that are challenged in terms of forage supplies. But the overarching thing is that what we're trying to do with our feeding is we are looking after what I would affectionately call this bag of bugs. It's going to do the vast majority of the work for us, and that's what we're trying to keep happy when we're feeding our ewe at any time, but particularly in late pregnancy. So when it comes to feeding meals of concentrates, we also have to be mindful of what we're doing to this wonderful bag of bugs that does most of the work for us. So what this slide does is it looks at the pH, the acidity, alkalinity of the rumen over a period of a 24-hour period, basically. We've got hours along the bottom. And the rumen actually likes to function around about neutral. So the bugs that digest forage really like to be at about 6.5, 7 pH, just about neutral. And at that point, they will digest huge amounts of fibre given the right level of non-protein nitrogen to go with it. But if we come along and we feed concentrates, and there's one meal and there's a second meal in a day, what we do is that we drop the pH because we're putting something which is starchy and sugary in there, drops the pH, and it actually dents the microbes that are going to give us fibre digestion. Now, smallish meals, so no more than ½ kilo in one go, will give us this sort of effect that you can see here, and the rumen will bounce back, and we can cope with that. But you can see also why a TMR works so well, because with the TMR, what we're doing is giving the bugs exactly the same food 24/7, and we don't see any change in pH. So I know not everyone can feed a TMR, but what we need to aspire to is to try to keep as near to that as possible, because that's going to keep our rumen absolutely stable. Okay, so forage analysis then. And everyone will guess I'm going to have another bang on this drum. And never was a year where it's going to be so much more important, because whilst we will put what we hope is good quality grass clover into our silage bales, we don't really know until we actually come to have an analysis how well that's actually been pickled, how well it's fermented, and what the dry matter is going to be, and therefore how it's actually going to feed. So a forage analysis is really critical because it dictates how much nutrition is in each mouthful. And as we'll see in a minute, it also has a big influence on how many mouthfuls the ewe can actually eat and process in a day. And when we're looking at potential forage shortages, it's really important that we also know how much dry matter we've got. So weighing some bales as well, critical. Those bales could be, I don't know, I can't tell from here, they might be 250 kilo bales. I doubt they're going to be, but some of my clients were dealing 800 kilo bales. So not only do I need to know the number of bales, we need to know how much forage we've actually got to work with. So in terms of silage quality, then again, a bit of a reminder for those of you who are thinking ahead now as to how you're going to cope with this. Benchmarks, we're looking for a reasonable dry matter and D value. Ideally, in silage, we'd want more than 10.5 ME. You can feed less, but you are going to then be thinking in terms of more supplementation. And as we've said, that makes that a little bit trickier in terms of keeping the rumen on an even keel. We want the pH to be 4 or thereabouts, a bit more. So a lot of big bales will be higher than that, and that's fine. They can be higher, and we would want the ammonia nitrogen to be less than 10%. If it gets to be much higher than that, it's suggesting that things aren't very stable, and it will also affect the intake characteristics. It won't be as palatable for the ewe. So that just gives you a little bit of a breakdown of what we're looking for in a silage for use. But what you can also do is you can have a quick look. I would definitely encourage you to send samples away to a lab, and importantly, don't just sample one bale when you do that. Make sure you sample 3 or 4 bales and just check that one of those bales isn't very much different to the rest, and just make sure you get a representative sample. But you can, by hand, have a quick look. So, if you squeeze it and you can easily get water out of it, then you're going to be 30% or less dry matter. If you can just get a little bit out of it, it'll be the mid-30s. And if obviously it's very dry, it's going to be 40 plus. How sharp it is, what quality of grass went in there in the first place. You can use a piece of litmus paper, or I've got a little meter that you can use just to have a look at pH. And you can use your nose as a sniff test. If it smells butyric and horrible, and it is going to be, and the ewes aren't going to eat so much. And one of the reasons why I've mentioned this is that it's actually really good, particularly where you've got different lots of silage, and you're perhaps not quite as confident in an analysis because you've not done it before, or you're not sure you took the right bales. It's a really good cross-check when you receive the analysis. Does this analysis actually suggest that it's the silage that I'm smelling and touching? And it's a really good cross-check. So how much will she actually eat? You'll find this table in Feeding the Ewe, and you'll find quite a lot more information in there as well. And I would urge you to download a copy and just have a look and see if you can work out for yourself what you would predict your ewes will actually eat in terms of dry matter intake in a day. You can see here in late pregnancy for our 70 kilo ewe, we're looking at somewhere between 1.45 and 1.75 kilos a day. 1.45 would be on a low quality forage where we're having to put a lot of concentrate in there, and not an ideal situation. 1.75, we can actually get above that with very high quality silages and minimal, tiny, weeny amounts of, say, a soya supplement. So it will vary, and I'll come back to that again in a minute. But what we actually need is that to start thinking in terms of, well, let's just have an estimate of what we think our ewes are going to eat. And I've just given you a little example there of a ewe eating 90 kilos of dry matter, so 1.5 kilos over 60 days rather, 90 kilos at 35% dry matter. I'm going to need to allow 260 kilos for ewe. And we can just allows us then to start building that up just to see that we've got enough silage, and if not, make a decision as to how we might cope with it at this stage. Couple of things to remember though, and again this is for those of you who've perhaps got some lean ewes, they will eat more. They're programmed to eat more. It's a really good evolutionary trick of the ewe in that when she's lean, she's more hungry and she will eat more. So just remember that when you actually start prioritising your feeding. And she could eat as much as 25–30% more. And younger and older ewes may eat less. So on these very high forage diets, younger ewes, they are struggling a bit. They're probably cutting molars. They're not used to the system. They might be getting pushed out a little bit. And at the other end, obviously, we've got older ewes that, again, their molars are starting to deteriorate and they're going to find life more difficult. So again, just bear those things in mind. And when we get to monitoring silage intakes, forage intakes, those are things you just have to have slightly tinted spectacles on when you're looking at your groups. So weighing some bales, as I mentioned before, is really important. So let's have a think. How many ewes have I got? What body condition are they in? Well, what analysis have I got? And how much silage have I got? And then if, like one or two of my clients, we have got a shortage this time, we could start thinking in terms of one or two strategies to get around that. So the sorts of things that are going to affect forage dry matter intake are going to be dry matter. Very, very dry or very wet silages will tend to reduce dry matter intake a little bit. If it's very low pH, for example, it might be a clamp silage with a pH down in the low 3s, that will tend to reduce intake a little bit as well. We've mentioned ammonia, digestibility, chop length. So a short chop, they will eat more because it's easier for them than if they've got to work really hard at a long, big bale that's not even been double chopped. Presentation we'll come back to towards the end, and also competition as well. So again, with these young ewes and old ewes particularly, if they're competed out, their intakes will drop back. So these are all things to consider at this stage. Really important though is that when somebody like myself or other colleagues, we actually give you a ration recommendation, we would always normally give you an outline as to how much forage we expect the ewe to eat. And it's really important that you then monitor that. Not down to the last little few grams, but over a few days, over a group of animals, how many kilos have they been eating, just to make sure that what we've predicted is actually happening. And if it's not, then it needs to be adjusted. Okay, one of the things that again concerns me, and I just thought it was worth mentioning tonight, is that some people, if they've got a forage shortage, basically will say, well, you know, I'll just ration it and I'll chuck a load of concentrate and it'll be okay. And hopefully, you know, well, the little bit that we've covered already tonight, you'll realise that that isn't a strategy that we would go for. And one of the myths that's been around for quite a long while is the one that's in front of you now, which says that the growing fetus reduces the ability to eat bulk food. What is true on this slide is that as we get towards the end of pregnancy, of course, the fetuses are getting bigger and they're pressurizing the rumen and giving the rumen effectively less space. What isn't true then is that if you get the feeding right and you look after the rumen, that stops the ewe eating much in the way of bulk, and you've then got to ration the amount of forage. Because if you just think about that, if you were a sheep in the wild and that was your strategy, and in late pregnancy when your demand for energy and protein was going through the roof, suddenly you could only eat a proportion of what you ate before, you wouldn't be very successful. So in evolutionary terms, the sheep doesn't suddenly become a pig where it needs lots and lots of concentrate. What it does, the strategy is simple. The rumen simply works faster. So the rumen outflow rate goes up by, it's about 4 times faster in late pregnancy than it is at maintenance, and it's almost twice as fast as it is about 4 or 5 weeks out from lambing. So she can process a lot of bulk very quickly, providing you give those bugs the right substrates to do it. So busting that myth, because it's really worrying. A lot of the problems that we see every year are down to the fact that people get frightened by feeding a ruminant forage. Don't be frightened of doing that, but do know what you're putting with it to make sure that that rumen can really make a job of it for you. And that brings me to a point on protein supply. I'm not going to go into, I haven't got time tonight to go into the details of how we calculate this. But again, feeding you, if you're interested, you can go and read that at your leisure. But already I'm beginning to get queries from people from around the country saying, well, you know, my ewes aren't looking too good. I've put some old hay out with them. They're still not within 8 weeks of, or they may be 7 or 8 weeks out from lambing, thereabouts, but they're not looking too good. And unfortunately, what happens in these situations, and what happens a lot with ewes at this point in time, is that people think that just because there's a bit of energy on offer, everything will be fine. And of course, what's happening is that the majority of the protein that the ewe needs, and she does need a maintenance supply of protein at this stage, and for the microbes to digest that rough old hay we're talking about, they need a supply of nitrogen, non-protein nitrogen. Unfortunately, what I think is happening is that these ewes are becoming going into protein deficit, and nitrogen is becoming a limiting factor at a very early stage. So most of the protein she uses comes from the microbes in the rumen. When they die, they go down to the small intestine and are digested, just as you and I would get our protein from a steak, for example. But if she doesn't have that nitrogen for the bugs, they can't digest the forage, and the ewe is shortchanged as well. So it's really just a plea to say to people, when you're thinking about these diets, the energy requirements may not be very high, but if they can't manage to get the protein out of the forage as well, then it doesn't matter whether the hay in theory has got enough energy, the ewe still won't be able to make enough of it. That's really important. So just bear that in mind, particularly when we start looking at low quality roughages. So things like straw and low quality hay, haylage, which of course, if we're trying to get through a shortage of forage, we're going to try anything, aren't we? But there's going to be a case, I think, this time where we might need to think about just supplementing a little bit with rumen degradable protein. And it's there where we might just find that using a source of degradable protein, such as a high non-protein nitrogen block, or maybe in TMRs we would add a liquid, so as we would add with maize silage, something with a high, a 40 or 65% urea liquid can be used, so we get this balance absolutely right. And another instance where this happens, and again you see this increasingly because quite rightly people are using roots to carry ewes further and further into pregnancy. But whilst roots are a good source of energy, protein becomes a limiting factor. And what we also see is that whilst the ewes are munching away on energy quite happily, once they get within that last 8 weeks of pregnancy, unless they've got a forage source that's or some green top that's giving us some nitrogen, then they hit the buffers and we do see protein deficit. So do be aware of that. And a final little comment about roots is that, you know, roots aren't a fibre source. You've got to think of them as wet cereals. So if you're feeding turnips or sugar beet or fodder beet or whatever, these are things that can help supplement in late pregnancy, but they're not forage replacers. And again, where it might be limited this time, you just need to be aware of that fact. And you will need to offer some long fibre to keep that rumen working properly. So while we're on that subject then of feed blocks, feed licks, blocks and buckets and so on, many of you know me well enough that they're not exactly my most favourite way of feeding sheep. But in this context, they were originally designed, and I go back this far, unfortunately, when they were first developed, we fed them to hill ewes in harsh environments where we had got Molinia and grasses which had potentially had a contribution but were very low in nitrogen, and we had to provide those ewes with non-protein nitrogen so they could digest those low quality roughages. And I think that there are people, and there will be people online tonight, who are in line to perhaps just consider that this time. I've certainly got 1 or 2 clients where we've gone back down that road, and certainly in some of our TMRs where we start off on the lower quality forages, we will put these high urea liquids in small amounts in there to balance things up. Now we use them much more widely, and what you've got to be careful of is that you are paying for convenience. So, you know, they're very expensive in terms of per unit of energy and protein, as energy and protein that can be provided from elsewhere. So you just be really careful. You know, you can be looking at 5 pence per megajoule easily, which is more than double feeding a compound. And if that's what you want to pay for the practicality, fine, but also bear in mind that you are only going to supply a very small amount, and they're only going to take 100, 150, maybe 200 grams a day. It's only going to be a small top up. So it might also be worth considering, am I feeding the right top up, if that's what I'm trying to do? Okay, so assessing the quality of compounds. Again, it's going to be expensive winter. They are not cheap this year. And, you know, I really just want to try and avoid people trying to cut costs and getting a false economy because they're frightened by some of the pound, you know, the amount per tonne some of these high quality compounds have got to. In my mind, hand on heart, you know, you get what you pay for. So we're looking for value for money, and you are always going to get the best value for money in terms of cost per unit of energy and quality of protein by going to the top of the range with whoever it is that you're dealing with. Now, there are 2 ways that you can make a really good informed decision on whether or not a compound is good, bad or indifferent. So looking at what's on the label, what's in front of you now is what has to be declared on the label. So they have to declare oil, and we want that to be between 4 and 5%. If it's more than 5%, then it will give you a high ME, but rumen microbes do not like oil and fat. They hate it. It coats the fibre. It's of no use to them as an energy source whatsoever. So stick with 4 to 5% as a good. You need a bit to make it hang together. So that's about where we should be. Ash, we want to be about less 10%. So ash is just basically the rubbish factor. Some of that's good rubbish because it's minerals and trace elements which are there and would be ash if we actually combusted the whole thing and we're just left with the ash. But equally, it's also things like fillers like limestone. So some of the cheaper compounds, and I'll show you an inclusion list at the moment, but you know, limestone weighs a lot and it's cheap. And so you need to be really careful that you know, you're not getting caught like that. Fibre, we would generally want to be less than 10%. This year, it might just be worth having a really good look though, because if we're in a situation where forage is limited, it might be that you want to talk to somebody about having a compound with a higher fibre. So digestible sources of fibre like sugar beet in there or even grass nuts or whatever, it's not going to be cheap. But providing everything else is okay and you can identify where that fibres come from, that might be a strategy you want to have a look at. Your crude protein as required. Just because it's 20% crude protein doesn't mean to say it's any better than an 18. Ignore that, move on to the list of ingredients and then start to really have a look at on that label what we're expecting to see if it's good quality. So we would want to see wheat. Wheat feed's fine. We can have a reasonable amount of that in there. Wheat distillers, sugar beet pulp, barley beans, rapeseed and soya bean meal and sunflower and palm kernel we'll come back to in a minute. But one trick that is worth knowing, I think, when you're looking at these, because the label is only in descending order, so if wheat's at the top, that means wheat is in the highest percentage. Look for where molasses is, because typically molasses is in there at 5 to 7%. So everything above molasses on the list is going to be in there at 5 plus. Everything below is going to be typically 5 or less. So if you're thinking about things like soybean meal, for example, if it comes below molasses, you know there's not a huge amount in there. If it's above it, then you know that there is a good amount in there. And equally, we've got sunflower and palm kernel in there. I'm going to fade those 2 out now because those are 2 things that I really don't like to see. Certainly not above the molasses if we're going to have a high quality product. And I've also highlighted there things like oat feed and low pro sunflower particularly. So you can tell quite a lot. Now I mentioned limestone and you know, that would always come below molasses, but if it's starting to come in there above the trace element mineral pack and so on, then you know that that's being added, and high calcium levels, which that will confer, will also tend to tip you over the balance with hypercalcemia if you're not very careful, because you're feeding too much calcium. So just take time, take care, and look at these ingredients. Okay, so a few practical points just to finish off. Time flies when you're enjoying yourself. In terms of troubleshooting, it's really easy to put together diets, and I can sit behind my computer and give people ration recommendations and so on. But the real trick of it comes when we actually put the thing into practice. And one of the things that we're really trying to do all the time is to present these diets so the intake is optimum and even across a group. And I think given where we've been in the last 12 months and seeing what I've seen out on farm in the last few weeks, we do have some quite significant variation between and within flocks. And prioritising, and planning groups carefully is going to be a real part of the job that we need to do this year. Young sheep in particular, they need time. And I would always say, well, house them first. Spread them out, give them space, let them get used to it, let them get used to actually being in the shed and getting those intakes in there, but be prepared to rejig. So if when you go through and you start doing your Heptavac P boosters, put a hand on these animals, and if you've got animals that are struggling and they're losing some condition, hook them out, rejig, give them a bit more space, give them a bit more TLC, and it really will pay dividends. And as we've said before, we've really got to monitor forage intakes against predictions, because with the best will in the world, even with an analysis and everything else, it's the ewe that determines how much she can and is able to eat. Sorts of common problems that we see, pretty obvious one there, too many sheep, not enough space. They really do need to be able to get in there and take fibre little and often if we're going to optimise these forage intakes. And similarly with the next picture as well, that's actually quite a nice bale of hay that's in the corner there. But A, access isn't brilliant, and B, look at the wastage. If ever there's a winter we can't afford to have that degree of wastage, this is it. So, really good opportunity to think about how you're going to put this forage in front of these ewes this time. And take a bit of time to just stand back and have a look at your feeding system. Now, this may be feeding outdoors as well. That shot there is of ewes in the middle of the day on a TMR system. They're eating, probably getting on for 1.8 kilos of dry matter a day each. But in the middle of the day, they're quite relaxed and they're sat doing what ruminants need to do, which is cutting. And interestingly, also grinding their molar teeth, which is really important to keep those surfaces right so they can continue to process lots and lots of fibre for us. That's really important. If you walk in a shed and every time you walk in, the sheep are jumping around like lunatics looking for the next meal, then that system is not offering the rumen the sorts of conditions that are going to give you the best results. Similarly, that's the same diet in the old shed. Sheep wheelbarrowing, trying to get in, not enough room for them all. The intakes on that system are probably going to be per ewe something less than 60% of what they are on the left. The telltale signs, as I'm sure you all know, are, and you can see it there, dirty backs, wool thinning on the backs where we've got the raiding parties coming in from behind to try to eat. That's going to cause us problems even with the best laid plans of mice and men. And if we're feeding straw, then just remember that they will need to bed themselves on about a third of it, and they'll eat the best 2/3. And that old girl's really getting into the spirit of it. Get your head in there, find the best bits, eat the best bits, and then you will do really well on straw. And interestingly, one of the strategies that I may well be using this time with one person who's a bit short on forage for the TMR is what we might do, we're considering it if we can't get anything else, is to take fit singles to one side and probably actually straw feed those on a flat rate with a good quality concentrate to try and save the good quality forage for the rest of the flock. So taking a positive decision and going for it to try and make the rest of the flock function well. And similarly with concentrates, just to finish off, you know, we do need to be able to get, if you're going to feed meals of concentrates, then they do need to be able to get to that meal at the same time. And we don't want them pushing and shoving and carrying on. And it might be that floor feeding is something that you can consider. I certainly use this a lot. It really does alleviate the need for space and it slows them down. They love it. They will spend all day, and so long as the pellet quality is good, and the way to know whether or not your pellet quality is good is when you start slapping it around in a shed. If you go in after 2 or 3 days and you've got a layer of dust on top of all the barriers between the pens, you know you've got your pellet quality is not up to it. But you won't find them. They'll keep going. They'll keep eating. They will find it. Evens it up and reduces lots and lots of physical trauma. But be warned, you can't just suddenly start doing that a month out from lambing. If they've not done it before, they need time. So if you're going to start this, you need to feed them a bit outside on the floor. Give them space, give them a bit of time to make sure everybody knows what's happening. Otherwise, it can have the opposite effect. And self-help options, you know, yeah, we have got these feeders on the left-hand side there, and some people are doing very well with them. I've got 1 or 2 clients who do very well, relatively small amounts of supplement, but great care and attention to detail. Those gaps need to be right, need to monitor how much they're eating, and you do need to be prepared to hook out the animals that it doesn't suit, and it doesn't suit them all. So the girl on the right there is possibly one that's had to be hooked out and had to be given another way of trying to supplement her a little bit that suits her. She's an older girl and not perhaps quite so ebullient as the others. But whatever you do, there's no such thing as easy when it comes to sheep. That might be easier for you, but these techniques do need careful monitoring and the right supplement to go with the forage. So in summary then, I've covered a fair bit of ground. Time's disappeared with me on again, and I'm sure that there are some questions. Just to summarise, I think 2017 is still having an effect on quite a lot of flocks actually, and now's a really good time to take stock. You know, it's easy to say, oh, well, it is what it is, I can't do anything about it. Yeah, you can. There's always decisions to be made, and the first decision is always the right decision. No decision is never right. Get to grips with your forage quality and quantity. If you think you're short, then look at the options now. There are options, there are things that can be done. Let's not run away from it. Don't be tempted to ration access to forage. There are other ways of doing this, and the temptation to do that is great, I know, but it isn't going to give you the results that we want. Could your ewes be short of degradable protein at the early stages particularly? Maybe have a little think about that one. If they are, then that's not going to help them later on in late pregnancy. Choose supplements carefully according to your forage. It's going to change. I've been doing a TMR meal for somebody today, quite different to what someone else would need. And spend some time organising your groups and monitoring forage intakes. And finally, stand back and watch how your ewes are coping with their feeding system. Just take time to go back in the middle of the day and say, is this working? Are these ewes content? What could I do to actually improve that? And you will be amazed what a difference that can make without any change to anything else. Okay, Katie, I think that just about finishes that, and we can take some questions.
Thanks very much, Lesley.
Sorry, Chloe.
It's all right. While I'm waiting for some questions to come in, I would like to remind you all that the presentation has been recorded, so it will be available on the AHDB YouTube channels, along with other previous webinars should you want to revisit it. In early February, we are also hosting a nutrition Q&A podcast with our sheep scientist, Liz King, so keep an eye out for that one. So on to the questions. First question is, what is a TMR?
Oh, sorry. Right. Okay. A TMR is a total mixed ration. And it's what in old money, those of us who are old enough would have called a complete diet. So it's a bit like feeding sheep like dairy cows.
Thanks. So presumably wet feeds can only be used when feeding TMR. Is there any suggestion that their inclusion leads to volumetric restrictions to intake, as by weight? So something like citrus pulp is not very energy dense.
No, it's not. But I would use. I wouldn't be frightened of citrus pulp if I could get hold of it at the moment. I would. I'm hoping we might get some. I'll be using it in one of my TMRs, and I certainly use it in a goat herd that I feed. So providing obviously something like citrus, you don't want to put too much in because otherwise everything starts stinking of citrus, orange and lemons. But no, it's not a problem. I mean, basically with the TMR, it depends what your base forage is, but you can afford to put some wet stuff in there, and so long as it's coming out and it's in the sort of mid-30s and dry matter overall, it's not a problem. So don't be frightened of water. They can cope with it.
And does soya count as a protein source to feed the microbes within the rumen?
Yes, it does, but generally speaking, when we talk about protein, we tend to normally talk about the quality protein, so the digestible and digestible, undegradable protein. And we would normally think about soya in that sense. But when we're feeding soya in late pregnancy, in the very latter stages of late pregnancy, roughly half the protein is degraded and half of it is undegraded. Earlier on, as things ramp up and things go faster and faster and faster, then so the amount that escapes being degraded increases because obviously it's spending less time in the rumen. So soya, roughly 50-50 in late pregnancy, but obviously it's expensive. And it's an expensive way of supplying that. So what we would normally try and do, if we can, is to satisfy the rumen microbes with a cheap source. Now, the cheapest source, but not easy and practical to feed unless it's in a liquid, would be urea. And dairy cow people would use that, the dairy farmers would use that, and we would use it in a TMR if we were feeding something like maize silage or a very low protein silage. So, yeah, soya has got it in, but it's an expensive way of doing it. So I hope that answers the question. There are cheaper ways of being able to give those bugs the nitrogen they need.
Thank you. And how much feed barrier space per sheep? So is there a recommendation, or what percentage of a group should be able to eat at one time?
Well, if we're talking about a TMR, then for a TMR, I would normally go for about 150 mil, or in old money, anybody wants about 6 inches. You can sometimes get that down a little bit more than that. So, well, we've got it 24/7 with a robot and so on. I would pull it down a little bit more, but generally 150 mil for a TMR. If you're feeding concentrate meals for an average size half-bred ewe, you'd want 450 mils for them to be all able to eat their meal at once. And if you go and download Feeding the Ewe, those sorts of tables are in that book as a reference for you.
Thank you. So I've got a person here that says their ewes are currently on stubble turnips. Is there anything to be concerned with when I house them in the weeks before lambing?
Well, it depends a little bit when you're actually going to be housing them and whether or not the stubble turnips, you've lost your tops and you're actually starting to get protein deficient. So what you've got to think about is what nutrition are they getting on the sugar beet tops? At what point am I going to house them? And do I need to provide, a segue so that they don't feel too much of a draft when they go from the stubble turnips indoors. So if you're housing at sort of say 6-7 weeks before lambing and there's still bits on top and what there, then that's not a problem. But if you're going to push it to 3 to 4 weeks, then the chances are that you need to start feeding them some supplement while they're still out on the sugar beet tops, so that you actually get a much smoother transition. Because what you have to remember is that the diet they're eating on these stubble turnips, the rumen is adapted to that. And we're going to change when you bring them in. If you're going to bring them in and put hay on concentrates or whatever it is, you're going to change that diet. And effectively, the rumen is going to spend several days adapting, and therefore your ewe is not really going to get very much to eat out of it for several days. And that's when problems occur. So think about when, what are the requirements at the time, have a look in the book and work it out, and then think, well, hang on a minute, maybe I do need to actually just smooth this step out so that I don't run into trouble.
Thanks, Lesley. And does a short chop length increase the risk of prolapse, or is that an old wives' tale?
I'm afraid it's an old wives' tale. It actually reduces it. So basically, the short chop length means that they will eat more for sure, and it can be quite scary sometimes when you've not done that before and you actually look at how much these ewes are eating. But providing you've got an analysis and you balance that forage up properly, the rumen will cope with it. Where we run into trouble with prolapse, I find particularly, is where forage isn't available all the time, so they pork themselves and then they spend part of the day not having any forage in front of them, or where you've got them eating forage and there isn't the right substrate in there, there isn't the right non-protein nitrogen, and the poor old bugs just can't deal with it, and then the rumen starts to falter. Or thirdly, we're chucking a load of concentrates in there and just giving the poor old bugs an acid stomachache or headache twice a day, and that's more likely to cause the problem. So hand on heart, eating good quality forage that's well balanced is a recipe to reduce your prolapse rate, and I mean that, reduce it seriously, not the other way.
Thank you. Do you have recommendations for feeding a lactating ewe in difficult situation that we have experienced this year?
Yeah, excuse me, a whole new webinar, I think. But with the lactating ewe, again, have a look at feeding the ewe. You'll see, and the table that I showed you, you can see that the dry matter intake for the ewe goes up again quite dramatically in early lactation. She will eat a lot more. And again, it's a question of saying, well, how much forage have we got? What can we feed with it? What do we need to feed with that to satisfy her demand? If she's going out to grass, then again, we would use sward height to determine whether or not there's going to be literally enough dry matter there to support her. So normally, if we can keep a 4 centimetre sward in front of her in early lactation, 4 to 6 centimetres, then there's enough grass there to be able to support her. And if you look at spring grass, if there's enough of it there, then nothing is better than that. There's plenty of protein in it, there's plenty of energy in it, and she will do a fantastic job. But again, it's a question of how much is available and what supplement do I need to actually put with that.
Thanks, Lesley. I've got a question here. What do you think about John Vipon's method of feeding soya as the DUP provision with silage through lambing? Is it actually better than feeding more compounds?
I'm a great fan of, if the silage is good enough, then feeding soya with that silage. I've got quite a few people, and that is what we will do. So we'll either feed soya, or what quite a few of my people do now is we actually buy in a high protein, so say 34-35% protein mineral vitamin pellet, which was designed normally to go with cereals, but we don't need the cereal bit, so we feed small amounts of that. That actually can be quite practical, and it's a similar approach. The only thing that I would say is that out of choice, I would prefer to give in a TMR situation. I would prefer to use beans rather than soya, and the reason for that is that there is evidence, and anecdotally, I think I'm happy with this now, that where we feed something like beans to get the protein in there, and also a little bit of starch, that does have an enhancing value for the quality of colostrum. So a little bit of starch and sugar in late pregnancy. But yeah, the John Vipon method is great, but you just need to be careful your silage is good enough. And quite a lot of silages out there aren't good enough to be able to get there just on soya alone. So please get an analysis.
Thanks, Lesley. And are there any diet composition tools available to use on the internet?
In an easy word, no. The only one that's available is FeedBite, that is one that SAC had available, but it's a long while now since that's been updated, and I certainly don't find it particularly useful these days. Don't shoot me, SAC, please. But there aren't. But if you download the Feeding the You book, what you'll find in there is what we have done is we have given you some really quite easy strategies so you can calculate it yourself. I mean, I've got little spreadsheets and that I use and so on. But actually, if you download Feeding the You, follow the square way that Kate's put in there, or the other ways, there's a couple of different strategies in there that are really quite straightforward. You'll be able to cross-check your diets. It's really not that difficult.
Thanks, Lesley. And could you talk about the ideal silage chop length, please? So how can you use big bale silage cut for cattle to supplement sheep?
Yeah, you can. You can use it. I mean, again, you know, obviously there's chop and there's chop as far as big bale is concerned. I mean, generally, if we're making it for sheep, we would like it to be chopped fairly short. You don't want it chopped to the point where it's absolutely tiny, though, because then that does rather start to go the other way in terms of it being a long fibre. So a double chop at minimum, I would say, for sheep. If it's really, really long stuff, yeah, they can eat it, but the problem is then they will pull it and they'll pull back and they'll drop half of it on the floor and they'll start wasting it. So if that's where you are, that's where you are. But if you're making sheep big bale silage in future, then do try and get a contractor that's going to be able to relatively short chop it for you.
Thank you, Lesley. And how do you rate sugar beet pellets as a feed?
Sugar beet nuts are an absolutely brilliant feed for sheep, and I think a lot of us were brought up on that. But do you know what? You know why? We've explained this tonight, is that sugar beet nuts are the most perfect digestible fibre. Rumen microbes love it. So whilst it's low in protein, and obviously we need to balance it up with other things, one of the things that I was always brought up on, and I didn't realise until latter years why it works so well, is that if we get into trouble, if you get into trouble with a feeding system with sheep, and someone's feeding a lot of concentrate and they've clearly got acidosis, then sugar beet nuts are the absolute saviour, because you can back off the compound, put a bit of sugar beet nuts in there, get the rumen back into a reasonable pH and functioning, and sort yourself out. So they're a bit of a godsend, actually.
Thanks, Lesley. And if you can't feed a TMR and you have to feed concentrate, are 3 smaller feeds per day better than 2 bigger ones?
I would say not. And there's a divergence of opinion on this. But my problem with 3 meals is that you're disturbing them 3 times. And so, you know, with the best will in the world, you're going to feed them in the morning, probably at lunchtime, and again in the afternoon. When do they get this period where they sit quietly and they do their ruminating and they do their, grinding their molar teeth down? So I have taken people off 3 times a day feeding, and in my experience, have found it settles things down better. 3 times a day feeding really just keeps them, they're just on their toes, they're forever looking for food, and never actually settle.
Thanks, Lesley. And if pregnant ewes are out on grass keep until 2 weeks before lambing, should they be given hard feed and hay whilst on grass keep so that they are used to hay and hard feed for when they come to lamb indoors?
Yes, I would say so, definitely. I mean, obviously, grass on its own, if there's plenty of it, is going to nutritionally be all that they need. You might want some mineral trace element type supplement in there. But if you're going to bring them in and change their diet, then, you know, as we were saying before, we do need this segue so that they're not getting a massive shock, or their rumen isn't getting this massive shock when they come in and then they start wobbling all over the place.
Thanks, Lesley. And could you talk a bit about in-field grazing? Is it just a case of putting them out and keeping an eye on their condition, or are there tests, so field or lab, which are worth doing to check the quality of grass? So this person has herdwicks on a scrubby piece of land for the first year, so they're doing a bit of trial and error.
Well, I mean, you know, grass is no different to any other forage. So therefore we should be thinking in terms of A, what's its quality, and B, how much of it is there and how much do we need to allow. So, you know, again, this year where forage is tight, there's a really hefty case for saying, well, you know, do you know what? You ought to be measuring what your dry matter covers are, and you ought to be rationing what those ewes need. If it's very low quality, then arguably, is it worth analysing? Probably not. But bearing in mind what I was saying about the non-protein nitrogen, it may well be worth thinking in terms of putting a high NPN block out with them so that they can utilise it better. But you know, it is no different. So just what we've always tended to do is just think, oh yeah, well, we'll just put them out there. If their condition's okay, we'll leave them. I think we need to get a lot smarter than that now. So where people have got deferred grazing and they may be strip grazing or whatever, then there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be looking at the analysis of that grass and matching that as they would do if it was conserved.
Thanks, Lesley. And how can you calculate the potential DM forage intake of a ewe?
If you go to there was a table in the webinar, and if you go to feeding the ewe and look up there, then it will give you the weight of the ewe and her percentage of a body weight as predicted dry matter intake. What it will also do is there's also a table there which shows you that the higher the quality of the forage, the higher the dry matter intake. And it also gives you some examples. So if you go to those two tables, and you can actually sit down and work it out for yourself.
Thanks, Lesley. And how does hay compare to silage quality-wise generally?
Hay generally we would expect to be lower in quality than silage, although we do get some good quality hays as well. So generally speaking, because obviously hay is made with more mature grass than silage, and the more mature it is, the lower the energy is going to be. So generally speaking, it is lower, and it tends to be quite a bit lower in protein as well. So I've seen quite a few hays this time that are quite seriously compromised as far as some protein levels are concerned. So hay's good, but it's generally not going to be as good as a good quality silage.
Thanks, Lesley. And how many sheep per ring feeder would you recommend?
Depends a bit on how big the ring feeder is. How big the patch is. But if you work on how big your ring feeder is and what area there is around it, and if you work on what I said before, is that if it's there all the time, an absolute minimum of 100 mils and preferably 150 millimeters rather per ewe, then you can work it out.
Thanks. And do you have any suggestions on how best to minimise losses from ram feeders?
Well, probably maybe not. I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? But if you're sticking a whole bale in there and just letting them get on with it, then that's probably going to increase the wastage more than if it is possible to actually, hold the bale on the spike over it and put part of the bale in there. Bit more work, but that at least then if they can put their heads in and they're not sort of pulling down and back. When they pull down and back, that's when they're going to waste so much more. So maybe just think in terms of a little bit more and often.
Thank you. And would you recommend to feed a high sugar feed block, so such as Crystalix, when feeding a compound nut?
No, in a word. If you're feeding a high quality compound nut and the diet is done right, then the only time I would consider possibly giving them an extra little bit would be maybe triplets for the last week or 10 days. But you really want to get that diet right and then not have to spend extra money on extra sugar.
Thank you. And what about organic? They don't have soya or urea options.
No, they don't, and organic can be a problem. In an organic context, to be honest, the best thing I think, and it's one of the really nice things that came out of being forced to look at the organic situation, is beans. So sheep can eat whole beans. You don't need to, if you put them in a TMI, you need to smash them up. But if you're just using them as a supplement, whole beans, great, and organic people can hopefully get their paws on those, or even peas and or both. You can feed full fat soya. But it's not ideal. But you can put a little bit of use a little bit of full fat soya as well. But it can be a challenge. But peas and beans would be my option if you're organic.
Thanks, Lesley. Several of your photos showed shorn ewes. Do you have any comments on this in terms of helping to make better use of lower quality forages through its effect of increasing intakes?
Yeah, someone noticed that quite a few of my clients do winter shear, and I'm very keen on it in the right situations. They do have to be housed for 7 or 8 weeks though for to get enough growth back on them. So it's not something that you can do if you're housing for any less than that. And certainly you wouldn't want to be turning out into really bad weather. But yeah, whoever said that question, generally speaking, we expect them to eat about 10 or 15% more when they're shorn. So you need to factor that in as well. The other thing is that shorn ewes, the other big advantage that doesn't often get talked about is that you tend to get much better birth weights in the lambs. And one of the reason for that, we think, is it's physiological, but in the context that a shorn ewe doesn't get heat stress the same, and she does tend to go full term. Whereas if you walk into a shed full of fully fleeced sheep, and certainly if you were to compare the two in a shed, what you find is the fully fleeced sheep, even on a relatively cold, blowy day, then respiration rate, they'll be bellowing. You can see them bellowing, whereas the shorn ones, just perfectly normal, relaxed respiration rate. So it has its advantages, but you need to go into it carefully.
Thanks, Lesley. And what is the best grass mix to use for silage to get away as much as possible from caking sheep and the costs associated with it?
That's going to depend a little bit on the farm, and it's maybe something that people want to have another webinar on with a grass expert at some stage. But of course, what we're trying to find, it depends a little bit on when you want to cut the silage. So do you want an early cut? Do you want a medium cut? So you need to choose your varieties according to when you want to cut them, the heading dates. And obviously these days we've got high sugar ryegrasses as well, which are brilliant. So we can get high sugar levels, high fermentable energy levels in there. And also, we would want to be thinking in terms of these days putting protein sources in there. So leguminous, and clover being the obvious one. So there's no easy answer to that, except to say, again, it's something that you can plan. So decide when you want to make your silage and then actually go for that. So there's no point in having all of your silage early heading 15th of May, if by that stage you're not even wanting to be shutting up for silage because you've still got loads of ewes and lambs in early lactation. So match it to what you want to do and then work it backwards from there.
Thank you, Lesley. And we've just got a couple of more questions, if that's all right. Would it be best when grazing turnips to strip graze and move the fence little and often so that there is a constant supply of both the bulb and the green top?
Yes, it would within reason. I mean, I think from a practical point of view, you want to go for, rather than perhaps really strict graze, is to give them a few days at a time, and that's fine. And again, the more control you get, the more you can get from the crop. But it depends whether or not you want to favour the animal or the crop. So the further into pregnancy you go, you might want to just switch that round a little bit from saying, right, I want you to utilise as much as possible of this crop, to being a little bit kinder on the animals and letting the utilisation rate drop a little bit as they get nearer to lambing. But that is the degree of control that you've got. Yeah.
Thanks, Lesley. And how many weeks before lambing would you recommend housing ewes, and why?
We only house ewes for our benefit, really. So, we have to ask ourselves why we're housing them. We're housing them to get them off the grazing and to give the grazing a rest. And that could be of little or great, less importance depending on your situation. And also because, obviously some people prefer to have them in there. They may want to be cross-fostering, etc., and not lambing outside in inclement weather. But it generally is for our benefit rather than theirs. So if you start from that, then I would say there's a kind of halfway house that's a bit dangerous. So if you're going to house them, I would like to see them in by 4 or 5 weeks before lambing if you can. If you're not going to do that, then you have to segue this very carefully, as we've discussed. If you're not going to do that, then I would say, well, literally maybe more or less just bring them into lamb for the last 10 days or a fortnight. And then at least if they wobble, they're close enough to lambing that you're going to get live lambs out of them. The worst point, I think, is to start housing them between 2 and 4 weeks, unless you're really careful to try and make the change as slight and as unbumpy as possible.
Thanks, Lesley. We've had quite a lot of mention of feeding beans. So what rate would you feed beans at?
It really depends on the quality of the forage. So if we're feeding beans instead of soya, then generally speaking, we would probably be feeding, in round terms, probably twice as much as we would be feeding soya. If that just gives you an idea, but with all the caveats that we've just said about forage quality. So if you were normally going to be feeding 200 grams of soya, let's say, then in very round terms, it probably be somewhere around about 375, 400 grams of beans.
Thanks, Lesley. I think we'll have to go for the last couple of questions now. When grazing fodder beet for the first time, you've mentioned adding a bale to provide fibre. Does the quality of the bale matter as much if it's just for the fibre, i.e. hay versus good silage?
No, I mean the main thing is that it's that it's there, it's long fibre. To be honest, I mean straw would do the job as well. It's just so that they have got some long fibre there to be able to pull at, and it's clean and attractive.
Thanks, Lesley. We'll go for the last question now. When should you introduce lifeline buckets to use on grass? So they've got plenty of grass, but they just eat trough tubs when they appear.
I'd question whether I would give them the bucket. If they're on, if the grass is there, it's good quality. You're monitoring it, you know how much they're getting, you know what your dry matter covers are, and there's no problem. My question to the questioner would be, why would you be doing that?
Thanks, Lesley. And I think we're out of time now, so thank you very much for that. Thanks for that brilliant presentation, and thanks to everyone for listening. I'm sorry we've not got through everyone's questions tonight, but we would advise you to go and look at the Feeding the Ewe manual that we have. I'd also like to remind you again that the presentation has been recorded and it will be available on the AHDB YouTube channels, along with our other previous webinars should you want to revisit it. So thanks again and have a good evening, everybody.
Good night, everybody.